There are no sponsors. The people who keep it going are those of us who watch it. It means taking a little money out of our pockets, but it's a small price to pay, really.
Welcome to the next segment of our interview with Michael Ratner, president of the Center for Constitutional Rights, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, a member of the board of the Real News Network. He joins us from New York. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
So, Michael, in the first segment of our interview, we talked about Cheney's interview with ABC and his defense of the tactics in the war on terrorism, and more or less makes the argument that we did what we had to do. It more or less worked. I think it was legal, Cheney says, but again, as we said in the first segment, that if something wasn't legal, well, too bad, we had to do it anyway. And they kind of made it legal through various presidential orders that may or may not have been constitutional. But one of the issues that we want to talk about in this segment is Guantanamo, and here's what Cheney had to say about that.
More than 2 years ago, President Bush said that he wanted to close down Guantanamo Bay. Why has that not happened?
If you're going to close Guantanamo, what are you going to do with those prisoners? One suggestion is, well, we bring them to the United States. Well, I don't know very many congressmen, for example, who are eager to have 200 al-Qaeda terrorists deposited in their district. These are not American citizens. They are not subject nor do they have the same rights that an American citizen does vis-a-vis the government. I don't know any in the nation of the world that would do what we've done in terms of taking care of people who are avowed enemies, and many of whom still swear up and down that their only objective is to kill more Americans.
So when do you think we'll be at a point where Guantanamo could be responsibly shut down?
Well, I think that would come with the end of the war on terror.
When's that going to be?
Well, nobody knows.
Once again, Cheney's essentially saying we did what we had to do. We're dealing with some very tough people. And he's further in this interview, he says if you bring them back to the United States, they're going to gain certain kinds of rights that will make it very difficult to prosecute them. And this is the realities of the war on terror, Cheney would more or less suggest. And what do you make of his argument?
He's trying to push Obama into a corner. Remember, a key part of Barack Obama's statements during the campaign were that he was going to close Guantanamo. And he's, I think, going to stick with that. And what's happening now, you're seeing an assault on that promise by Cheney and a number of other, moderate, even right-wingers saying we can't close it, these people are bad people, we can't try them, we got to keep them there, set up preventive detention or something like that. But let's really look at the numbers, Paul, for a second. There's 250 people left at Guantanamo. Over 500 have been freed, which Cheney acknowledges. It's not like we're seeing a whole bunch of terrorists out there running around trying to kill us. They have freed 500. They were not the worst of the worst. Most of them were picked up through bribes and other means. Of the 250 remaining, we at the Center for Constitutional Rights think 220, 230, maybe even 240 can actually be returned to their home countries with no problems if there's good negotiations diplomatically, which there have not been by the Bush administration. And if they cannot be sent back, then they have to be given asylum. And recently we had an incredibly wonderful thing happen. Portugal said it would agree to take people from Guantanamo.
And what will they do with them? They put them into prisons there? I mean, if these people in theory are people that are the hardcore and worst of the worst, what's Portugal or even their home countries going to do with these people?
I don't know how to demolish that theory of people that these are the hardcore and the worst. They aren't. I mean, in some cases, some people may wind up in a prison, but generally they are not the hardcore. They're not the worst of the worst. The original figures on Guantanamo, when there were up to 750 people, there was something like 8%. According to studies out of New Jersey, 8% were affiliated with al-Qaeda. So we're not talking about the worst of the worst. We're talking about a lot of guys picked up in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and other places in the world, taken to Guantanamo, never given any rights. And you can see that. The first hearings we've been able to get in federal court, finally, after 7 years, with the Bosnians were accused of a conspiracy to bomb a U.S. embassy. The administration dropped the charge even before we got to the hearing, and 3 of them are already back in Bosnia. So we're not talking about that. Now there are 10, maybe we think 10, maybe less. The administration says more, 30 people who need to be tried. Some of these key players who the administration claims were involved in 9/11, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Those were people who were not originally at Guantanamo, but were brought there from secret sites, so-called, as they call them, although I don't like the term.
So let's back up and go to the bigger picture again, which is what we talked about in the first segment, that the Obama administration is going to have a serious look at whether or not to prosecute George Bush and Richard Cheney. As you mentioned, the New York Times has called for a special investigator. For years now, there's been a movement to impeach Cheney and Bush based on violation of the Constitution. The question is, as we said earlier, there doesn't seem to be too much taste for this in the Obama administration. Why does it matter? Because the counter-argument's going to be, it's all over and done with. We're in this enormous economic crisis. Let's bury this administration and just move on. Why does it matter to prosecute these people?
I often hear what you just said, that it's looking backwards. But my answer to that is really simple and straightforward. It's not looking backwards. It's looking forward. Because if you want to prevent or deter torture in the future, the Guantanamos of the future, you have to have prosecution. Because any new administration, whether it's this one or the next one, has an easy ability, as this one did, to manipulate the laws. President Bush said, I can override any law. I'm the president. Criminal law doesn't apply. The only method of preventing torture in the future, and really the only one, is sending a message of fear through these guys. You torture, you will be prosecuted. And so you've got to open a special investigation and look at these torturers.
And on the issue of wiretapping, on the issue of Guantanamo, on the issue of going to war, on what I think is pretty clear now is manipulated intelligence with intent, not mistaken intelligence, which we hear this administration keep repeating and the media rarely ever taking them up on. The issue of conducting an illegal war, most of the world sees this all as war crimes. But again, I guess in some ways it comes down to, are we going to be living in a monarchy or not? Kings don't like prosecuting kings. They don't like taking on kings and restricting the power of kings. And is the new president going to take this on? Do you get any sense of it?
Unless there's a strong movement to push for prosecution of the torture conspiracy or program, prosecution of the illegal Iraq war, and prosecution of the warrantless wiretapping program, which was openly and notoriously criminal, then I don't think the Obama administration will do that. Because I do think there's a certain reluctance, as you said, for kings to prosecute kings. It limits their own power in a way. And so it's going to take a strong movement here. And what you're going to need in this country is all of us, the human rights groups and others, and from around the world, saying we need to have accountability, and we need it through prosecutions. It's what we do, Paul, it's what we do with the guy who does shoplifting. It's what we do with the guy who does a burglary or a robbery. Crime, the whole system is based on deterrence.
You've had some success in terms of launching your own law proceedings. What can be done? Let's say Obama and the Democratic Party doesn't want to do this. From a legal point of view, what can citizens do to pursue their own course of the prosecution of these crimes?
A number of things that can happen here. One is, there's a whole push now to get indictments around the war in Iraq, particularly from states in the United States that lost their soldiers or lost their men from the states or women in the war, and get murder or manslaughter indictments against Bush and Cheney for basically taking us into a war that we shouldn't have been taken into. That you can go to your local district attorney about. That's one thing. The second thing, there may well be pardons. So local people have to start screaming in this country and around the world about pardons. If there's pardons, of course, it's going to be very difficult in the United States to get any prosecutions. Abroad, pardons don't count. You can't pardon war crimes. You can't pardon torture. So they don't count. And then my office will continue pursuing international prosecutions, which, if there's pardons, of course, Europe will really be looking at these much more, much harder than they did before. Because I think Europe is very upset over a country that could run a torture program, a war program, and a warrantless wiretapping program with complete impunity. And my view is the world's going to become a very small place for the Cheneys and the Bushes of the world.
Is there anything that an Obama administration or a democratically controlled Congress can do post-pardon? A pardon can't be undone. And also, would the federal pardon, a Bush pardon, affect a state prosecution for murder?
A pardon is a finality. I mean, we might challenge it, or somebody might, but in fact, it's almost impossible to challenge in the United States. Congress could set up an investigatory commission that could then issue a report if there was a pardon. They may do that anyway, even without a pardon. I prefer prosecutions, but they could still have an investigatory commission and issue a report, which is the most you would probably get them to do if there was a pardon. A pardon will not pardon a state prosecution.
So the real hope for prosecution in the United States, if there's a pardon, will be at the state level.
That's correct, and I would say it's a hope that's, it's a hope. It's not the strongest hope we could have here, because there's all kinds of reasons that it's difficult, and so far, no prosecutor, even on a state level, has stepped forward.
So people, if they want this process, need to let their representatives know with some force.
Their local district attorney. You're from any state in this country. Every state has lost people in the Iraq War. You can say this was an illegal war. This was an unauthorized war. This was a war we were tricked into, and people died as a direct result. And people were going to die when you trick people into it. And that's actually essentially a manslaughter claim. And I think it would be interesting to see some state prosecutors go after this.
And of course, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan are far from over. Thanks for joining us, Michael, and thank you for joining us for this series of interviews with Michael Ratner. Endless wars, abuse of powers, declining living standards, and the climate change crisis. The stakes couldn't be greater in the U.S., and with your help, we're moving our news operation to Washington, D.C., where we'll focus on money and corruption. For example, big oil and arms companies shape American economic and foreign policy with far-reaching effects on the lives of ordinary people. With allies in government, trade unions, the media, and in think tanks, they're a hidden hand that controls the commanding heights of American politics. Taking on the industrial military complex is what real change requires. Even former presidents and high administration officials have said so. But corporate television news treats such positions as marginal. Uncompromising journalism requires questioning assumption, interrogating structures of wealth and power. Corporate TV news just won't do it. Only a news organization that's truly independent can tackle such issues with courage and tenacity. And we'll take on corporate TV news live. You'll watch TV news with our panel of writers, journalists, scientists, and historians. You'll be able to join in by phone, webcam, chat. Together, we'll discuss and debate what's the real story and take on the myth and the propaganda. But this is only possible if you support us now. We need to prove that a viewer-funded model works. So if you want the real news, we need you now. Please click on the donate button and give generously. Now's the time to decide if you want the real news to thrive.
Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute at therealnews.com.